Hello from the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, I'm having an amazing day. And if I'm having an amazing day, well, you should also be having an amazing day. Alright, let's get down to today's video. First of all, before we start the video, I would like to say a few words on the Jocelyn Chia incident. Now, for those of you who are not aware, Jocelyn Chia is a Singaporean comedian who's based in America, who was basically shitting on us Malaysians. You know, I know the Singaporeans are still salty about the breakup that occurred in the 1960s when Singapore was expelled from Malaysia, but that's another story for another time. Now, anyway, she was shitting on Malaysians, saying things like, you know, that basically, you guys are still a developing country while we're a first world country. Yeah, first world country where you see elderly people working in hawker centers for fear of having their socio-economic benefits cut. But anyway, what Jocelyn Chia said angered a lot of Malaysians because she also made a reference to the MH370 plane, you know, the Malaysian Airlines flight that went missing. She said that some jokes don't land, and that's why Malaysia has not visited Singapore in 40 years, right? Of course, many Malaysians were very, very upset with Chia's her gaffe, and basically, you know, that incident really united Malaysians more than any other incident this entire year. You know, Malaysians are usually at each other's throats for racial and religious reasons, but when it comes to food, Malaysian food's better than Singaporean food, by the way. Anyway, when it comes to food and when it comes to, you know, issues concerning the dignity of the Malaysian people, oh, Malaysians are all united. When somebody shits on Malaysia, especially somebody from Singapore shits on Malaysia, we're all united. Malaysia boleh. Kita satu Malaysia. And Jocelyn, you guys may be a first world country, but at the same time, you know, every country progresses at its own pace. Every country has, you know, its own internal problems to deal with. And basically, at least in Malaysia right now, you can be a socialist, a Marxist even, without being put in cold storage, if you get my drift. Anyway, let's begin today's video. Right, but first of all, I want to say that I don't have a problem with Singaporean people in general, and you know, I have many lovely friends from the island down south, but at the same time, Malaysia's problem is really with Jocelyn Chia, as not with the nice, decent, hard-working people of the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Singapore. Okay? Now let's begin today's video. You know, there's a very famous story of Confucius, the philosopher of ancient China. Although if I were to be pedantic, I wouldn't say he was an ancient Chinese philosopher, because China as a geopolitical entity didn't really come about until well over 200 years after Confucius's death. But anyway, if the ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius, let's just call him an ancient Chinese philosopher because much of Chinese culture draws inspiration from Confucius. Let's not be pedantic. The ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius is known to have visited a king, right? And this king basically asked him, right, how can I reduce the problem of thievery in my nation, right? And Confucius tells the king that the ruler is the wind and the people are grass. Grass bends in the direction the wind blows, right? So set a good example and the people will be good, right? That's not the only story about Confucius. There are a dozen other Confucian stories, that basically give give us a light as to the wisdom, humanity, and compassion of this great man who lived 2,500 years ago, right? Confucius also advised the kings of the warring states to practice moderation and restraint. And basically, instead of resorting to cruel punishments such as amputation, branding, whipping, or the death penalty, Confucius advised rulers to set a good example for the people, right? Because fundamentally, according to the Confucian doctrine, which is opposed staunchly by the Chinese legalists, all human beings are born fundamentally good, but they are corrupted by their environment, right? So if you were to punish people, they would only avoid committing crime out of fear, but they never would have learned their lesson, right? Basically, the idea is that you should instill a sense of shame in people, and they will naturally avoid crime, right? But if you don't instill a sense of shame and you only instill a sense of fear in them by the threat of punishment for their transgressions, well, what happens is basically you create a shameless society where people are only afraid of being punished but are not avoiding crimes out of the genuine desire of their heart, right? So fundamentally, Confucius does not place the blame on individuals when he sees societal problems. Confucius places the blame on systems, which is what we are going to get into today. One of the strong themes that you see in modern Anglo-Saxon societies, namely America or Great Britain, is the concept of personal responsibility, right? Which actually ties in with the concept of individualism. Because while the Eastern philosophers like Buddha and Confucius viewed people fundamentally as part of a large collective and social problems as being a symptom of a failing society, the modern Anglo-Saxon conception is vastly different in that it views societal problems not as a problem of a failing society. At least the modern right-wing capitalist Anglo-Saxon conception views societal problems not as a failing of society, but as a failing of the individual. So, for example, you have homeless people, single mothers, drug addicts, alcoholics. Anyway, let's keep going on, and so on and so forth. These things are fundamentally treated by the modern West, right? At least the right wing of the modern West, as being a symptom of a personal failing, right? Rather than the failing of society, which basically demonstrates the juxtaposition between Eastern and Western thinking at extremes. When I say Western, I'm referring to modern Anglo-Saxon Western. I'm not referring to the Italians or Greeks here. Because Eastern thinking is fundamentally collectivistic. Well, you probably knew that modern Western Anglo-Saxon thinking is fundamentally individualistic. So it's not a surprise why many people in Anglo-Saxon Western countries like America would view, societal problems as being a sign of a person's personal failure, right? If you're poor, it just means you are not good with money and, well, you simply were too lazy to get a job. If you're a drug addict, it just means that you are morally weak and that you have no self-control. And if you're Well, if you're a homeless person, that means that, well, you got in that position because nobody wants to share a home with you, basically. Your family threw you out and nobody wants you. And that's basically your own problem. So now, the idea of personal responsibility and rugged individualism is so firmly entrenched in the American zeitgeist that it is very difficult for many Americans, especially American right-wingers, to possibly imagine that a person could be in a difficult situation not through any fault of their own, but due to a failure of the system which has allowed this person to fall between the cracks, right? It is as difficult, I suppose, as it would be for you or I to imagine what it would be like to have 6 legs. You can't, right? You can't imagine what it's like to have 6 legs. Just like it's impossible for a right-winger in the Anglo-Saxon 21st century, in the 21st century Anglo-Saxon world, to possibly imagine that a person could be suffering or could be the way he or she is due to not to a personal failure, but to a failure in the system. Because fundamentally, individualism and basically personal responsibility are two themes that keep getting drilled in the American's brain, right? America is just an extreme example, but the fact is that any country which adopts neoliberal capitalism as its economic model, as opposed to socialism, will end up receiving traits of this ugly, rugged individualism, right? Now, granted, the cultures may remain more or less the same, at least the social norms may remain more or less the same, right? But at the same time, you're going to find a lot more selfishness, a lot less empathy, and a certain contempt for the downtrodden, which is part and parcel of the rugged, individualist, social Darwinist philosophy that capitalism breeds, right? In fact, I will go so far as to say that countries in Asia which have adopted neoliberal capitalism, like Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on, South Korea, and so on, right? I don't want to sound like I'm putting the people down, but I will say that these countries have been better off economically as a result, but worse off spiritually as a result. Yes, capitalism has produced beautiful things, such as this gold-plated Victorian mirror. Do you like it? Capitalism has created palaces for the rich and hovels for the poor. It has created enormous amounts of wealth juxtaposed with enormous amounts of suffering. Capitalism has indeed lifted millions of people out of poverty, but thrown even more people into poverty. It has created a class of people who thrive off the poverty of another class of people, and even more egregiously tell this other class of people that they are poor because of their own personal failings, and not a failing of a system which inordinately rewards a certain group of people. But because people in an individualistic society are taught to believe that their failures and successes are entirely dependent on their own merit, apparently, these people fail to consider that had they been born in a different set of circumstances, they too would be just the very same as the poor, downtrodden people they despise. But because the concept of individualism teaches people that everything is deserved, right? it is very difficult indeed for wealthy people in an individualistic society to ever feel any compassion or any empathy for the poor and downtrodden if they subscribe to this individualistic mentality, right? Because ultimately, it is very easy to explain poverty, right? If you don't point the finger at systems and you just point the finger at personal failings, right? It's a good way for people, basically people in a society who are exploiting and oppressing others, in order to explain why others are being oppressed and exploited by them. You know, you are being exploited and oppressed, not because you are exploited and oppressed, but because of your own personal failings, basically. And I am exploiting and oppressing you because, you know, I'm simply a better human being than you are. I'm simply a higher grade human being than you are. That's why I got to the position by the sweat of my brow in order to exploit and oppress you. But if you work hard enough and with a little bit of luck, perhaps one day you too can be an exploiter and oppressor, just like me, right? That's basically a very convenient way to explain the injustices in society that people perpetrate, right? I suppose the ultimate individualist would be someone like, say, Jordan Peterson, for example, the Canadian right-wing philosopher Jordan Peterson. Now, if you've ever delved into the thought patterns of that madman, God help you, I actually need counseling after reading some of his works. But anyway, the ultimate example of this rugged individualism would be someone like Jordan Peterson, who's basically trying to justify the world the way it is, right? Rather than, you know, trying to change it. You have people like Jordan Peterson who wants to keep the world precisely how it is, and using this individualism to justify their place on the hierarchy, right? He creates this thing called the dominance hierarchy, and he basically goes on about how, you know, people vary in terms of intelligence, people vary in terms of competence, and people who rise to the top are simply, you know, more intelligent and more competent, and not that they had better schooling, more opportunities for schooling, parents who could afford better schools, and parents who could pay for their tuition fees, and they weren't born into a ghetto. But anyway, the fact of the matter is that Peterson is not profound because he simply regurgitates every single Western conservative Anglo-Saxon talking point, that your failures or successes are entirely incumbent on you, and that, you know, it's got nothing to do with your environment that's causing it. Basically, it's all genetic, apparently. You know, these American Nazis like Peterson love to bring up things like IQ or standardized testing or things like that, basically, to try and show that basically it is not the system that is at fault as to why certain groups do worse than others. It is not the system that is at fault as to why some people do worse than others. It is not the system that is at fault as to why there are very rich people and there are very poor people who are struggling to make ends meet. It's just that rich people happen to be smarter, wiser, more intelligent, a higher grade of human being, in fact, and poor people, well, they simply have less intelligence and competence than a rich person. I mean, I've already debunked IQ testing in my other video. Measuring intelligence is a fool's errand. I debunked this notion of that this Western conception, this Western obsession with putting a number on everything, even something as abstract as intelligence. You can actually check out this video if you have time. But anyway, the fact of the matter is that these rugged individualists are basically the new age feudal lords of our time, right? The feudal lords would tell you that I have a right to oppress and exploit you because, well, it's in my blood. I'm simply better than you because I've got blue blood, right? But because capitalism overthrew feudalism, right? Now the new feudal lords of our time, the capitalist overlords will say, oh no, it's not that I've got blue blood or anything, but my class of men is simply better than your class of men, simply because we have more wits, we have more intelligence, we've got more wisdom, and that's why we should rule over you, right? It's basically a repackaging, as I've mentioned before, it's a repackaging of the feudal system to make it under the guise of egalitarianism and democracy, right? So that's why, although in some ways society did improve under capitalism, it would be only fair to admit that, because the capitalist overlord can't chop off your head if he's not happy with you, right? Although he can sack you, and he can make sure you never get a job again, so he could still kill you indirectly. Anyway, the fact of the matter is that the feudal lord held sway over you by the power of the divine will of God, right? But the capitalist dictator holds sway over you by the divine power of capital, right? The almighty dollar. And the fact that he can break your rice bowl anytime he wants to, he or she. Let's not be sexist here. And that's why I'm a freelancer. I don't work for a capitalist. I work for myself. I teach and I get paid for my services. But I'm not a capitalist in that I don't own a business, and I don't want to work for a capitalist. That's why, because I want job security. I don't want to be basically beholden to any man or woman, right? The way you guys are if you have to work for a boss. I'm going to show you an excerpt from Frederick Douglass's autobiography. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Frederick Douglass, Douglass was an American slave who taught himself how to read and write and escaped and got his freedom, right? Now, Douglass brings up a time when his mistress, or I should say the lady of the house, basically taught him how to read. She taught him the basics of how to read. But then, when the slave master, her husband, warns her against doing that, she not only stops teaching him how to read, but becomes very angry when he tries to learn how to read. Take a look. I lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. I had no regular teacher. My mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, had, in compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct, but had set her face against my being instructed by anyone else. It is due, however, to my mistress to say of her that she did not adopt this course of treatment immediately. She at first lacked the depravity necessary to shutting me up in mental darkness. It was at least necessary for her to have some training in the exercise of irresponsible power, to make her equal to the task of treating me as though I were a brute. My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. In entering upon the duties of a slaveholder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained to her the relation of a mere chattel, and that for her to treat me as a human being was not only wrong, but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. When I went there, she was a pious, warm, and tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering for which she had not a tear. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, and comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities. Under its influence, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. The first step in her downward course was in her ceasing to instruct me. She now commenced to practice her husband's precepts. She finally became even more violent in her opposition than her husband himself. She was not satisfied with simply doing as well as he had commanded. She seemed anxious to do better. Nothing seemed to make her angrier than to see me with a newspaper. She seemed to think that here lay the danger. I have had her rush at me with a face made up of fury and snatch from me the newspaper in a manner that fully revealed her apprehension. She was an apt woman, and a little experience soon demonstrated, to her satisfaction, that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. Did Frederick Douglass's mistress start out as an evil person? Probably not. Did Frederick Douglass's mistress harbor any malice towards people of African descent, at least until she was taught so by her surroundings? Probably not, right? It is only due to the fact that she is a product of a system which oppresses, enslaves, and abuses these African people that she too becomes part of the system, because fundamentally she is a product of her surroundings, right? She too is a victim of a system that not only dehumanizes African Americans, or they weren't American at that time, not only dehumanizes people of African descent, but also dehumanizes white Caucasian people in basically causing them to lose their humanity. Humanity being the central tenet of a person, right? So basically, you have to admit that the loss of this woman's humanity was not due to her individual failing, as Douglass freely admits, but due to the fact that she is a product of a failed system. But basically, to end this video, you're never going to get down to solving a problem if you don't get down to the heart of that problem, right? If you see mass homelessness, mass incarceration of a certain race of people, you see droves of single mothers in a society, you're not going to get to the heart of the problem if you simply chalk it up to personal failure, right? Because you're not going to have any motivation to get to the heart of the problem if you think the heart of the problem is literally staring you right in the face, right? So you're not going to solve this problem. Like, remember the video I made a few days ago about the right-wing MAGA communists complaining about the homeless people on the sidewalk, calling them the sidewalk lords, and basically talking about how dangerous they've made America? Have they made any suggestions on how they can solve this problem of mass homelessness, right? If there are dangerous, mentally ill homeless people around? No! They just say the homeless are like landlords of what? Like in Chairman Mao's time. Oh, the homeless are cruel to the pedestrians, just the same way the landlords were cruel to the serfs in feudal times. But these people fundamentally, they call themselves socialists, but socialists tend to focus on systems rather than individuals, right? They are fundamentally rugged individualists because they're blaming homelessness on personal failings by saying that homeless people are just lazy and basically failures as people, losers, so to speak, right? So they're never going to solve the problem because they already think the problem is unsolvable. They think that person is a lost cause and basically there's no hope for that person. Basically that there's no way to solve it, and basically that is basically a symptom, I would say, of this very, very toxic individualistic mentality. Because rather than feeling compassion for homeless people, what you feel is disgust. What you feel is contempt, not compassion. So I don't think it's possible to be a socialist with modern American characteristics. I really don't. Unless America has an overhaul in its philosophy, that rugged, toxic, individualist mentality, socialism's never going to take place in America. It's never going to take off, just like socialism is not likely to take off in Singapore first, right? Between Singapore and Malaysia, I still think, despite our race tensions and despite our political instability, I still think that socialism will take off in Malaysia first. I really, really do. And I'm going to get down to that more in my next video. Well, without further ado, I think that's all I want to say today. So take care, everyone, and have a lovely day. Malaysia is the greatest country in the world. All other countries are ruled by little girls. Malaysia is #1 exporter of petroleum. All other countries have inferior petroleum. Malaysia is the greatest country in the world. All other countries are run by the gays. Malaysia is the greatest country in the world. Our southern neighbor has the world's worst Asian food. Malaysia is the greatest country in the world. All other Asian countries are run by degenerates.